I'm going to get us started if that's all right with you.
Sounds great.
Great. Well, I just want to thank everyone for joining us tonight, taking time out of your busy day. My name is Michelle Ashton. I'm the Director of Communications for the Fish and Wildlife Foundation of Florida, and I'm going to be acting as our moderator tonight. Just a couple of guidelines to get us started. Your mics were muted when you joined the call. Please keep them muted unless you have a question. We're going to have a Q&A section at the end for your questions, so you can hold into then. Sometimes you have that burning question you want to make sure you don't forget. In that case, feel free to send those to me at any point to the Fish and Wildlife Foundation chat, and I'll be keeping a record of those, and I'll make sure they get answered. Similarly, if you have any technical issues or questions come up during the call, send those to the chat as well, and I will do my best to get them fixed and solved for you. We are recording tonight, and we'll be sending you a copy of the recording in addition to any links or facts shared, so you can relax, not worry about having to take any notes, and just enjoy the conversation. And I think, that's all of our housekeeping items. So I want to introduce the Foundation's President and CEO, Andy Walker, who's an avid birder himself and just came back from seeing a couple of Florida scrub jays not too long ago.
Thank you, Michelle. And I want to thank everyone for being on this today. We're joined by three distinguished scientists here in Florida, have been working hard on the Florida grasshopper sparrow, and you'll have a chance to hear from them and talk to them. And I want to thank each of you. This is a special webinar we are doing for all of the folks who have donated to the Florida grasshopper sparrow. And I appreciate a number of you joining us live tonight, and we'll be sending this to all of the many other donors to this project as well. Let me begin by just saying a word about our foundation. We were founded 26 years ago to provide support for the State Wildlife Agency, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, FWC. And its many partners. So our mission, just like FWC's, is quite broad. And we have 5 main initiatives, which include conservation of iconic Florida species. And certainly the Florida grasshopper sparrow is at the very top of our list, being the rarest, most imperiled bird in North America. One of the things we're going to do tonight is explore some of those reasons of why we think populations declined so severely over the last 20 years, what some of the stresses and threats on the bird population are, how it's currently doing, and what is the prognosis for the future, which I think you'll be happy to hear continues to be encouraging. We're going to start by introducing Dr. Juan Oteza. Dr. Oteza, Juan is the senior lead scientist on the Florida Grasshopper Sparrow program. He received his PhD at University of Montana and has been working on the sparrow for the last 2 years, as has Sarah Biesmeyer, who is the lead technician on the Florida Grasshopper Sparrow work. And we'll be joined later by Andrew Schuman. Andrew works for a very interesting nonprofit organization in the northeast corner of Florida called White Oak Conservation. Has a very colorful history. The white oak, that is. I don't know if Andrew has a colorful history, but he probably does too. But we probably won't get into that tonight unless you ask questions about it. But I'd like to maybe, Juan, have you start off to introduce yourself a little better than I have, and perhaps paint a broader view of the Florida grasshopper sparrow and the issues surrounding it.
Great. Thank you so much, Andy. I'm going to start by sharing my screen here. I need permission to do so.
We walked through all these issues, and I thought we had this. Give me 1 second, Juan. Let me see what's going on.
In the meantime, I just want to say that, as Andy said, both Andrew and Sarah and myself are going to be presenting today, but I also wanted to emphasize that the conservation of Florida grasshopper sparrow is a large collaborative project, and there are many institutions, state and federal wildlife agencies, as well as organizations that are involved in it. And, we're just gonna be presenting part of this work with emphasis on the breeding of birds at White Oak and then releasing them into the wild. But there are many other aspects that we're gonna touch on. And I just wanna mention that there are many other folks involved in that effort.
Juan, do you want to try the screen share again, see if that's working?
Seems to be working. Okay, can you see that now?
Yeah, we're in good shape.
Okay. Let me set myself up here. All right, so as I said, the main focus of what we want to talk a little bit about today is some of the work that we have been doing, breeding birds at White Oak and then releasing them into the wild. But before we get there, I also want to provide a little bit of background on the other work that we're doing, because I think it's important to put things in context. So before we get there, this is a broad structure of our talk for the three of us. I'm going to provide background on the species, talk a little bit about the decline of Florida grasshopper sparrows, some of the conservation actions we're taking, including conservation breeding of birds at White Oak. And that's the part that Andrew is going to be talking about. And then Sarah is going to tell us about how the releases, like what happens during the release of the birds and some preliminary results that we have so far. So Florida grasshopper sparrows, of course, are the most charismatic bird definitely in Florida. They like Florida dry prairie, which is the habitat that you see here on the background. They prefer dry prairie that is dominated by grasses, and they nest in these grasses. Their nest is like a baseball size ball. It has like a side entrance, and it's a roof and a base made out of grasses, amongst some grasses. As you can imagine, it's pretty hard to find, but we have a great team that is led by Sarah, doing the hard work of finding those nests. So the Florida grasshopper sparrow is a non-migratory subspecies of grasshopper sparrow. So it's a resident. It lives year-round in the dry prairie of Florida. So a little bit about the decline. Of course, the decline of the grasshopper sparrow, the Florida grasshopper sparrow, is the main reason why we're doing the work that we're doing. And what you see here is a population trend for 4 populations. So each of these lines represents a population that we're monitoring, along with some of our partners and collaborators. And what you can see is that all 4 populations show a decline over time. And this has been going on for several decades. As of 2018, there were roughly 48 male, or estimated to be 48 males across all 4 populations. So clearly things were very critical, and they still are. But so as you can tell, this is just males. The reason why we count males is because they're easier to see. They're singing, and they're trying to establish territory. So historically, that's the method that has been used to index the population size. But nowadays we have much more detailed information, and we actually know that there were about fewer than 30 pairs back in 2018 that constituted the population. Okay, so what are the causes of this decline? One of the main causes, the historic main cause, is habitat loss. So in this map here, this is a map of Central Florida, and the shaded areas in gray are Florida dry prairie, the historic extent of Florida dry prairie. And what has happened is that 80 to 90% of the dry prairie has disappeared, has been converted to either cattle pastures or agriculture. And as a result, of course, Florida grasshopper sparrows populations have declined. In this map, you can see that there's several icons like asterisks, triangles, and circles. All of those indicate historic records of Florida grasshopper sparrows. The 4 current populations that I mentioned earlier are all located within the red rectangle at the top of the map. So a dramatic reduction in the extent of the range, and this only covers about 3 counties nowadays. So what are some of the conservation actions that we're taking to help Florida grasshopper sparrows? We're performing research on the causes of the decline beyond habitat loss. We believe there are other causes that continue to affect the species, and we're doing work to try to determine what those are. We're monitoring and protecting the population, and I'll get into what that entails. We're managing the habitat for Florida grasshopper sparrow, and then there's the breeding that takes place at White Oak. So I'm going to talk about each of these a little bit. In terms of population monitoring, what does that entail? We catch birds either while they're adults or when they are still in the nest, and we put a unique combination of color leg bands, and including an aluminum federal band that has a number to be able to identify the birds in the future and track their history without having to recapture them. So with this unique combination of bands, we can then observe the birds, we can re-sight them and perform behavioral observations. And this allows us to not only determine the survival rate of the species, but also do things like trying to determine when they're starting to breed, and also how successful they are at breeding, the productivity of a population. So we're keeping track of all those things. Once we find the nest, which, as I alluded to, it's not an easy task, we perform a couple of actions. Well, one of them is we build this predator deflection fences, which is what you see here in the image. These are circular fences that are about 15 feet in diameter. And what you can see on the top of the fence here, the distance, that's a Florida grasshopper sparrow going back to its nest with food to feed the young. So these are open on the top. The birds don't have any problem coming in and out, but it does prevent small mammals, which are the primary predator of these nests, from entering predating the nest. The other thing that we do is that ahead of big storm events, we lift the nest off of the ground for about an inch or so to help it to prevent the nest get flooded. And combined, these two actions have dramatically improved the productivity of the wild population. So this has been very successful. Under land management, one of the main things that we discovered early on is that grasshopper sparrows require recently burned prairie. What I mean recently burned, they prefer prairie that has been burned within the last 2 years. They rarely nest in prairie that has more than 2 years since it was burned. And here in the image you see on the left side a very recently burned prairie, but this bounces back quite fast, and within the season birds will use it. And just a couple months later, and on the right side you can see a prairie that was burned a year earlier. Lastly, for land management, the other action that we take is mechanical removal of woody vegetation. So if, for example, the given area has not been burnt regularly, or for whatever other reason, there's encroachment of woody vegetation, fire alone cannot revert the prairie back to its grass-dominated condition. So we perform this mechanical removal using a tractor, and this has proven to be very successful at reverting the prairie to conditions that are more suitable for sparrows. And we're actually starting some research to quantify this effect. So as you can see, this is a multi-pronged approach that we use towards conservation of grasshopper sparrow. And of course, the most recent of these actions is breeding birds at White Oak and releasing them into the wild to augment the wild population. So for that part, I'm gonna give it away to Andrew so he can explain a little bit of that part.
Hey everybody, you guys see my screen?
Yep.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so thanks Juan. My name is Andrew Schuman. I'm an animal collections manager at White Oak Conservation. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about our role in helping recover the Florida grasshopper sparrow. So a little bit about White Oak first. As Andy said, we're a rather large facility in Northeast Florida. We have about 17 to 18,000 acres, somewhere in there, right on the St. Mary's River, which is what separates Florida from Georgia. Most of that land, of course, is on the Florida side, but we do have some on the Georgia side. And so we've got a long history, and I could talk about it forever, but I'll focus on the conservation work we're doing mostly. And so our mission, right now we kind of have three pillars to our mission. It's conservation breeding, education, and land stewardship. So we have a lot of land. It requires management. So we're not just trying to save species around the world, we're trying to save species in our backyard. So a lot of prescribed burning and stuff like that. And education is actually a newer program for us. So it's really great to have local school groups out and to show them all the work we're doing and kind of create that next generation of conservationists. So conservation breeding, White Oak, we have a lot of space. It's very quiet. We're not really open to the public, sort of. And so animals tend to do very well there. We can give them very large enclosures. We can keep them in their natural social groupings, and we can house large numbers of them. A great example is rhinoceros. So, white rhinos don't breed if you just have one male and two females. You need a large herd of animals in a big area. And so White Oak is fortunate to be able to do that. And so we've worked with large charismatic species. The three on the screen right now these are the big ones we've worked with for the past couple decades. And cheetahs, at any given time, we have about 30 cheetahs, and that's required in order to successfully propagate them. And okapi, we've done a lot of conservation work with okapi, and we have a lot as well on our property. So, but beyond those species, we also do a lot of work for recovery of species. So it is quiet, and we have a lot of land, so we can manage species in a way that makes them very wild, and not a whole lot of disturbance. So Florida panther, we work with FWC to rehabilitate Florida panthers. If they get struck by a car or something along those lines, we basically have 12 acres of fenced off woods that once they recover from their medical injuries, they can go out there, and then from there we work with the state and get those animals released. We work with whooping cranes and Mississippi Seminole cranes. We breed them and release them in large groups every fall. We also, of course, the sparrow, and then we also work internationally as well with. We've released Andean condor in Colombia and worked with some of the curassows down there as well. So sparrow, we got involved mostly in 2015. So at that time, I think it was fairly well known that the species was on an extinction trajectory. And so the question was, how do we bring them in? And what's the best way to do that? And how do we care for them once they're within our care? And then how do we propagate them? And then eventually, how do we release them? The first steps really is just how do we bring them in and how do we care for them. And so in 2015, we partnered with FWC, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and Tall Timbers, and we started with eastern grasshopper sparrows, which is a more common species, but there wasn't enough Florida grasshopper sparrows to start off with them. And so that was very successful. And by 2016, the eastern grasshopper sparrows are breeding, and then you start to release those. And then because the techniques we developed were so successful, that's when we started with the Florida grasshopper sparrow in 2016. And we built our flock for the next 2 years or so until releasing in 2019, and annually since then. So before we go into all this stuff, why bring them in? Why bring them into our care? Why not leave them in the wild? So at White Oak, we have the ability to control a lot of these things that hurt them in the wild. So the biggest one is predation. We can build enclosures that exclude snakes, which is a big predator of the species, and aerial predators and all those things. So fire ants, we have 3 acres where we keep the sparrows. And so we can treat that entire site for fire ants. We treat hundreds of mounds with hot water, and we can control them. So we can have 13, 14, 15 breeding pairs of sparrows in a given area, and it's easier for us to control some of these things that may inhibit successful reproduction and recruitment in the wild. So how do we do this at White Oak? Well, it's not too dissimilar from a lot of our other recovery programs. We have a big space, and we try to mimic the natural history as close as possible. So I'm a huge bird watcher. I knew a spot at White Oak where I saw eastern grasshopper sparrows wintering, so it's not too far off to assume the Florida grasshopper sparrows would do well there. And so we created a larger area. We improved the habitat, and of course put the enclosures right on top of that area. And so that was a typical enclosure in the early years. And we implemented fire. As Juan said, this is a fire-dependent species. So fire is extremely important to help with seed production that the birds eat and insect production that the bird also eat as well, but also reduces vegetation. And it's just an exposure that I think would be good for them prior to being released. And we burn in the enclosures with them. They actually seem to like it. They seem to, like, some males will actually sing when there's fire right next to the enclosure, which is really interesting. And all this stuff works. So the grass grows, they eat the grass seeds that they're supposed to eat. They eat the grasshoppers that they're supposed to eat. And eventually you get offspring. So what's it like to grow endangered sparrows? This was a fun little thing for me to put together, because it is really very accurate. So the first step is in the spring, your males start to sing, and they start getting aggressive to neighboring pairs, and then eventually your female disappears. This is why both myself and my team are always so impressed by FWC and the field teams, because we have trouble finding birds in an 8 foot by 30 foot enclosure, but they're finding them in an entire prairie, which is just incredible. And we're always shocked by that. So there's actually a sparrow in the middle there on a nest. So we end up finding the female. We know she's got eggs. Of course, eventually those eggs turn to chicks. I don't use the word cute very often, but the chicks are extremely cute, and we really enjoy them. And so after 9 days, those chicks leave the nest, and before you know it, they're pretty close to being independent nutritionally. So this is actually Dad with, he's actually got 5 chicks, although there's only 3 or 4 in the shot. So Dad's feeding the chicks. So you might be wondering, well, where's Mom? Well, the female is actually incubating another clutch of eggs. So right after the chicks fledge, about 5 days after that, she'll start laying another nest. She'll have eggs. So it's really incredible. So right now she's incubating probably 4 eggs, and there's 5 chicks on the ground. So, and that's just one pairing. So every 25 days, a nest hatches from one pair. So from March to September, that's happening. And we have 13 pairs. So it's a lot of birds to kind of keep track of at any given time. And it certainly is very challenging, but it's a good challenge. It's a very good challenge. And then eventually, once the chicks are nutritionally independent, we separate them from their adults. We do a full health evaluation. We put bands on them, we sex them, and then we put them in a big group. We call them cohorts. And they live together in these big groups, feed together, and we're very hands-off with these guys. And we call this a breakfast party. Tend to see that quite often. So during this whole process, we've learned so much about the sparrow, just bringing them into our care. I remember in the early years, I was talking to someone. I said, yeah, the males are building nests, and they were just looking at me funny. And they're like, males aren't supposed to build nests. What are you talking about? So it was always thought females just build the nests. In actuality, that's not the case. Well, they do, but the males start them. They're just usually not that great. So the females finish them off. So the other thing is the trill call. This was historically known as the female call when I started working with these guys. And that actually is a female making that call. But we learned pretty quick that it's not really just a female call. The males will make that as well. They'll respond to the females after they make the trill call. And also when they're nest building, they'll make the trill call as well. So we've just learned so much. There's a huge list of things like that, which is just really interesting. So it takes a village to raise a child. Well, it also takes a village to raise a sparrow. There's the husbandry team, there's the veterinary team, there's the maintenance team, there's our intern program. So we do have a grasshopper sparrow internship, so we get to train people on this conservation program and all this stuff. So and also I told you we have an education program. Well, on the bottom left, that's actually a school group that they did a competition to see who could sweep for the most grasshoppers to feed the birds, and that was a lot of fun. Actually, they enjoyed that one. But probably the thing that resonates most with us at White Oak is just the teamwork of this program. The fact that we're able to work together to save the species, share ideas, question, what's going on, and just troubleshoot and stuff, and have fun while doing that. That is really what makes this program enjoyable to us. And so I also just want to thank everybody on the Zoom call for your support and supporting this work. And you can visit White Oak if you're interested. So just gotta reach out to us. It's by appointment and things like that. So.
Thank you, Andrew, very much. Sarah, are we turning things over to you? You're still muted. There you go.
Right, 1 second. Okay, you see my screen?
Yes.
All right. So hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Biesmeyer. I'm the site supervisor for Grasshopper Sparrows for FWC. So after White Oak's hard work of rearing and caring for the birds, it becomes time to transport the birds and release them into the wild. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So on the day the birds are going to be transported from the release site, White Oak staff will corral them in their enclosures, they'll capture them up, and they will reevaluate their condition. So these birds have already gone through a broad health screening process, but before transporting them, we still like to look them over, make sure that they are still in good condition, their feathers look good, and there's no health concerns, and they're ready for release. We will then give them that unique set of color bands that Juan was mentioning before. And that's the main way that we'll identify them in the wild. But we will also give, so we'll give them color bands. But early on in the project, we also fixed a radio transmitter to some of the birds in order to see how they would do their first few days after release. So we were able to kind of see some of their short-term survival right after release by tracking them with these radio telemetry backpacks. So then to transport them to the release site, White Oak has constructed these really nice sturdy transport boxes. We'll fill them with a nice substrate of wiregrass that the birds can sit on. We also throw in a few mealworms for the birds so they have a nice snack for the road. And then we'll load them up into a nice cool shaded car and transport them down to the release site. We transported between 2 to 20 birds per trip, with 20 being the maximum. And as you can see, that's a lot of birds right there. So we'll transport them down to our release site where we have this aviary that's been constructed. It's modeled exactly like the ones at White Oak. And this picture was taken right after the aviary was constructed. So we burned, the prairie was burned in this section before the aviary was constructed. And that's why all this vegetation is really scruffy and not grown up. But over the next couple months before the releases occurred, the prairie had time to grow back, and the vegetation inside the habitat, inside the enclosure, mimics the habitat outside. So we've got nice dry prairie habitat inside for the birds to enjoy. And you can see that here, this is inside the enclosure. The habitat has, the vegetation has grown up. So we'll transport them down, put them into the release aviary. So you can see Juan here releasing the birds into the aviary. And we will monitor their behavior during this acclimation period just to make sure that they're doing okay after transport, make sure that they're kind of exploring their habitat well and finding the food bowl, and all the birds have done great so far. That's actually me back there kind of peering in and making sure that the birds are all doing well after being released into the aviary. We will also monitor their behavior using trail cams that we'll place on their feeding stations, and these we just look at to make sure that the birds are still doing well, not showing any abnormal behaviors, and that they're still ready for release in a few days. So we acclimate the birds between 2 to 5 days. And this acclimation period is just, again, to give the birds some time to adjust to their new environment and get used to the conditions at the release site. So once release day comes, we will open up the aviary and let the birds out. So here's a bird flying out. More often, they usually just walk or hop out, but occasionally some will fly. This great picture was taken by Juan. They often don't like to leave the aviary on their own, so we will go in after about 30 minutes to an hour of giving them time to leave the aviary. We will go in and gently encourage them. So here's a video. You can see them take their first steps into the wild. As you can see, they usually just scurry kind of around on the ground like little mice, but sometimes they fly like that one. And there I am in the background, just kind of gently encouraging them out of the aviary, and we'll do a couple sweeps through to make sure that everyone's out before we close the aviary back up. So far at the release site, we have released 253 birds between 2019 and 2020. So in 2019, with our short-term monitoring of the birds via that radio telemetry or opportunistically resetting the color bands, we confirmed that the birds were behaving like wild sparrows. We saw them foraging on their own and flying around and exploring the prairie and even interacting with other birds. So this like short-term survival and these behaviors we were seeing were really great. But the question remained if these birds would survive long-term, if these birds would settle in the prairie, and if these birds would breed, which are all things that are crucial for the success of this program. So in the spring of 2020, we got our answer. We began to see release males perching up and defending territories. They were displaying behaviors just like wild birds. So they were acting the same. They were displaying natural normal behaviors for this species, which was great to see. And they really became incorporated into the wild population. We had release birds start to pair up, but they paired up not only with other release birds, but we also had release birds pair up with wild birds. So we had wild males pair up with released females, and we had released males pair up with wild females. And about a little bit over half of our breeding pairs had at least one released bird. So once they found mates, they bred. This nest here was from a pair where the male was a release bird and the female was a wild bird. And about 62% of nests had at least one released parent. I'm going to show a quick video now of from one of our nest monitoring cameras. This is a nest where both parents are release birds. He's about to go feed the chicks. You can see those three little mouths back there. You hear them begging too. I think this is the male, but I can't really see the color bands. I'll put that one more really quick in case you missed it. You see those three little mouths back there. So this was very exciting. So the birds were pairing up and they were breeding and they were tending to their young successfully and they fledged young. So this is a picture of this fledgling right here is not only the first fledgling that we had in our 2020 population, but also the first known fledgling produced by release parents in the wild. So the cute little historic bird. And about 65% of fledglings produced in the wild came from nests with at least one released parent. This fledgling down there, the male was a wild bird and the female was a release bird. So again, it was really interesting to see those birds pair up and really become incorporated into the population. And then not only pair up, but breed and then fledge young. I'm going to show another video from our nest monitoring cameras. This is again a pair of release birds. So first you'll see that's the adult, that's the release female, and she's followed by her little fledgling. there he goes, off to greet the world. So something important to mention is that, so Juan was talking about some of the nest protection protocols that we do at the release site and at all sites. So we protect every Florida grasshopper sparrow nest that we find with these predator deflection fences. So that includes all the release birds too. So we protected all of their nests with these fences, and we also lifted the nests when needed. So you can see this is a released female with food in her mouth. She's about to go down to her nest and feed her chicks. So as Juan mentioned earlier, there were an estimated 48 males across all populations in 2018. In 2020, we detected 81 males. So this increase was in part, but not exclusively, due to the release efforts in 2019 and 2020. And this blue line here represents the population at the release site. So other factors that account for this slight increase in population are nest protection from the predators and the flooding events, and also habitat management that's done across all sites. But these releases have definitely boosted the population at the release site. And we project that the population at the release site would have declined if it would have not been for these release birds. Almost half of our population was made up of birds who were release birds. So moving forward, we're going to continue with releases. The first releases of the year will be happening in just a couple weeks. But the releases are just one of many actions to help the sparrows, while ongoing research identifies the management solutions to the factors that are limiting the sparrow population. And so we're going to also continue with habitat management and population monitoring and protection. So in summary, we saw good settlement and recruitment. So our results are preliminary, but we met the goal that we set in our recovery plan, and our results compare favorably to other studies and to the wild birds. So we definitely are happy with the results we're seeing so far. However, the population is still critically endangered, and we're definitely not out of the woods yet. So we still have a lot of work to go to help this species recover. But the initial results, they're very encouraging and exciting to be a part of. And we're looking forward to collecting another year of data for this study. And these releases are helping do what they set out to do, which is helping to grow and stabilize the population while we look into some other reasons the population may be declining. So very exciting to be a part of. And that's all I have today. I guess it's time for questions. Stop sharing my screen.
If anybody wants to, they can send Michelle a question by using the chat function, if you don't want to unmute and speak.
I actually, this question, I had two questions that came to mind. Sarah, maybe could you talk about, Andrew talked about what they're doing for fire ants at White Oak. I'm wondering how y'all control for them in the wild as well.
Yes, so they are definitely a concern, especially at the ranch sites or where the prairie is more disturbed. So the site I work at, we're fortunate where we don't have to deal with many fire ant mounds, but there are other sites with where it is more of a concern. So what we'll do is, after finding a nest, we'll conduct like a survey around, make sure that there aren't any mounds within about 10 to 15 meters of the nest. And if we do find any fire ant mounds, then we'll do what Andrew was mentioning, which is we'll treat them with hot water. And by doing that in the field, we have a little like turkey fire stand where we boil water on, and we'll bring that water directly to the ant mound, dig it up, and pour the water in to hopefully eliminate that threat. Because once the eggs hatch, the nestlings are extremely vulnerable to being predated by fire ants. And it's actually such a big problem at some other other sites that were actually have a better method of doing this, where they have an actual bigger kind of trailer that is, and I'm not too familiar with the details, but there's a bigger setup for them to be able to treat ants much more efficiently and more ants than you can with just a little setup that we have at our site. So they're definitely an issue.
We've received 2 questions in the chat. One is, what is the life expectancy for Florida grasshopper sparrows?
I'll take that one. So it's variable. They can be quite long-lived. Sarah, what was the male, the longest living male? Is it 7 years old at least?
Yeah, I think he's at least 7 years old. We think he's about 8 years old. Yep. Right.
And that's at least. We don't know when it was born. That's a bird that we banded as an adult already. So we estimate that he's at least that long-lived. But on average, those are, so physiologically, the birds have the capacity to live many years, but there's extrinsic factors, like there's predation and other factors like harsh winters that may just don't allow the birds to live that long. So on average, they live much less, 2 to 3 years. And that it's usually, it's also different between males and females. Unfortunately, females have lower survival rate, and that's presumably because they are physiologically more worn from all the effort of breeding, but also because breeding, tending to the eggs in particular, exposes them to getting predated themselves when the predator comes to the nest. So for that reason, and potentially other reasons, the females have lower survival rate.
We had one more question in the chat asking, and Andrew, this might be a good question for you since you were talking about the eastern grasshopper sparrow. What are some differences between the Florida grasshopper sparrow and the eastern grasshopper sparrow?
Yeah, well, the biggest one is probably range and migration behavior. So Florida grasshopper sparrows are non-migratory. Eastern grasshopper sparrows are migratory. Although there are some very small non-migratory populations, which are kind of weird. We don't really truly understand why that is. That's one difference. One of the bigger differences we noticed was that the Florida grasshopper sparrows are very dark in color. They have much different patterns on their nape and back, and their song is very different. It's really hard to tell from your ear, but I did have one intern that swore that she could tell the difference, and I believe her. No, but it is, they do sound different. They do behave different. To us, it was pretty obvious.
We had a question about if both sexes incubate.
Just the female incubates. The good males will tend to them, though. Males will feed females while they incubate, and again, will help with the nest building and things like that. But strictly females. Juan, do you concur, Sarah?
We got one more question that just came through. I'm going to read it. Can you talk about how this effort differs from the effort to save the Cape Sable Seaside Sparrow? I don't know if any of you worked on that effort, but if you did, if you could speak to the differences.
Andrew, I think you probably know more about this. My understanding with the Cape Sable Seaside Sparrow is that there were a lot of delays in taking action. So it was kind of too late by the time some of those actions took place. But Sarah or Andrew, you want to elaborate?
Cape sables are it's a non-migratory species in very, very South Florida, Cape sable. But they from my understanding, it's a very low population, but the wildlife biologists have been able to maintain the population through management action. Whereas with Florida grasshopper sparrow, we didn't have that option really. I mean, they declined so rapidly. There was another species of seaside sparrow, the Dusky seaside sparrow, which was by Merritt Island, St. John's River over there, and that one, from my understanding, that by the time the action was took, there wasn't enough birds. They only caught males. And so the population went extinct.
Yeah, that's what I meant, was the Dusky Seaside Sparrow. Not
And something, a similar question came in is are there any plans to do a similar effort for the Florida scrub jay? I don't know, again, if any of you can speak to that, but.
Well, so Carl Miller, who's also with the Fish and Wildlife Research Institute, which is the research division of FWC, which is what Sarah and I work for. And he's also a investigator with the Florida Grasshopper Sparrow, but his main focus is Florida scrub jays. A lot of the work that they're doing is translocation of scrub jays. I believe there's some breeding in captivity at some places, but the primary focus of with scrub jays is to kind of start populations where there were historic populations, and also to improve the genetic diversity at some of those populations that are very small, particularly with birds from Ocala National Forest, which is the biggest and most genetically diverse population. So the efforts are different in the approach, but a lot of kind of the concerns are the same.
One more question came in about if hurricanes affect the birds today.
It's a great question. We don't know. That's the short and honest answer. We don't really know. Because we are gathering all this data by having all the birds banded and trying to see their survival over years. Once we have enough data, we can compare survival over different years, and maybe we cannot get directly at whether, if you have a year with a lot of extreme weather events, if that it's associated with lower survival on average. But it's indirect information. We can't really know for sure at this point. It would be really interesting. I think technology, it's advancing to the point where you could put tags on birds that allow you to kind of answer those questions, but we're not quite there yet.
Another question came in about how do you determine the sex of the sparrows?
Andrew, you want
to? Yeah, we do. You can do it multiple ways. You could send in a feather. You could send in a blood sample for sexing. But we've had a great partnership with FWC and Fish and Wildlife Service and us and all the breeding facilities that we could actually submit buccal swab samples. So when the chicks are young, they'll gape for food, begging for food. And what we get is a little piece of litmus paper, and we'll put it in their mouth, and they think it's food, so they bite on it. They kind of do this action, and they get saliva and epithelial tissue on there. And so we can actually put that in a solution and submit it to researchers at the University of Florida, and they'll give us results back in a day or two on what the sexes of those chicks are. So it's pretty neat.
Yeah, that's a primarily, I just want to add to that, that's a primary way in which we do it, especially with chicks. In the field, if we see a bird, we often can tell based on behavior, but, there could be instances where you're not sure, especially if you catch a bird on the net where you cannot see it behave, and, then you can't quite tell.
So I'm going to trust that the bird biologists are going to understand this question better than I do. Do breeding females develop a brood patch?
They absolutely do. So a brood patch is just vascularization of the basically the underside of the bird. And what they do is that they lose some of their feathers and just kind of becomes more vascularized when it comes to incubate eggs, so that they can shunt blood to that region of their body and actually, transfer heat to the eggs. They definitely do that. That's another way in which we can determine if the sexes, just from that brood patch development, if we have the bird in hand.
Julie, I see your question. I'm going to save it for the end, because I think that's a great conclusion for us and for Andy to end on. So I just wanted to let you know I see it, and we're going to absolutely get to it. Juan, I was interested in the chart that you and Sarah showed, and it looked like around 2007 and 8 there was an increase in the population, then a decline again. Do you know what accounted for that?
I don't, and I don't think anyone does. Anyone knows. We, the one thing is that those point count surveys that were made were not necessarily as consistent over time. So there could be just a measurement error, those early ones, but the population was not monitored to the extent that it is today. So we don't really know.
We're getting a lot of good job and congratulations and thank you for your work. So I want to pass that along to the folks doing the work. Before we get to Julie's final question, do we have any other ones?
You want me to say a word about the DeLuca property, Michelle?
Yeah, so I think Julie's question is a really good lead into that, Andy. She's asking if there's any grant funding or how the work is done. So I thought you might want to talk about that and then talk about the DeLuca work.
Okay, and I invite Andrew and Juan and Sarah to jump in here. In the same way that Andrew said it takes a village to raise a fledgling sparrow or to raise a sparrow, it takes a village to fund the raising of a sparrow. Our foundation has been, thanks to those of you on this call and others, we've been raising private funds to support the captive breeding program and other aspects of Grasshopper Sparrow program. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service provides a great amount of money every year, and FWC also provides funds. One of the ways we provide funds, though, is through the Conserve Wildlife license plate. If you've seen the license plate with the bear on it, we receive $25 from the sale of every one of those plates. And all of that money goes into endangered species and habitat management. At the same time, White Oak is contributing a tremendous amount via its scientists taking care of the birds. So while we're helping provide money, we in the service and FWC are providing money to White Oak, they're probably providing 60 cents to our 40 cents in order to do this program. So we're really grateful for them. The other thing I wanted to mention is that another success this year is about a third of the 30 adult breeding pairs that we had back in 2018 are on private land. They're on, most of them are on a ranch. And that ranch was protected this fall. It was owned by the DeLuca family, who were the founders of the Subway restaurant chain. And originally, 20 years ago, they bought the property expecting to build about homes for about 250,000 people. This was going to be the core of a large city in the Everglades headwaters. That plan never came to pass. And so Elizabeth DeLuca decided to donate the property this year to the University of Florida as an agricultural and ecological research station. And the conservation group Ducks Unlimited will hold a permanent conservation easement over the property to ensure that it's never developed. And we committed a $200,000 to that project as well, half of it to endow the monitoring of that easement. So there's always someone at DU or elsewhere who can spend time out there every year to make sure the university is complying with the terms of the easement. And then the other 100,000 will go into various management needs there for species. In addition to the sparrow, it has red-cockaded woodpeckers and a few other notable species, crested caracaras, indigo snakes, gopher tortoises, and the like. We think that the property was being well managed by the DeLuca family, but having it now in public ownership with the University of Florida is going to give us new opportunities to probably enhance habitat there further. There's some good prairie habitat that probably just needs more intensive burning and rower chopping. to improve it where the birds aren't using it now, but possibly we could establish another population there. But what's interesting overall about DeLuca, and Juan and others can speak more to this, is it is a working cattle ranch, and the sparrows have continued to do as well there as elsewhere in grassland habitat that's partially improved and is grazed at regular intervals by cattle. So there's a lot to be learned there about what are the secrets to why that population is able to be compatible with cattle. Juan or Sarah, did you want to say anything more about DeLuca?
Yeah, I would add, I think what you said is exactly right. I think that population differs a little bit in the habitat in which they breed, and it offers great opportunities for better understanding what those differences are and how, why is it compatible? And I think that's important for the future of Florida grasshopper sparrow conservation, is to try to understand how birds can survive and reproduce in those private ranches, because that's an important part of the Florida ecosystem.
Michelle, that's all I had.
Great. Well, we're 1 minute shy of our time. So I just wanted to thank everyone again for your excellent questions and for your time today, and thank our biologists and Andy for being here to lead this conversation. I think everybody's been giving it big thumbs up. The videos were fantastic, great photographs. It was good to see the little baby sparrows. And if anybody has follow-up questions they want to share, feel free. You should have my email. That's how you received the meeting invitation today. So feel free to shoot me an email anytime. And like we said, we're going to follow up with the recording, with links that were shared. I'll bug the biologists to see if they're comfortable sharing their presentations as well with y'all, the slides. So we'll make sure you get information. And if any questions come up, feel free to email me. And if they're specific about the birds, I'll pass you along to the gentleman and lady who have all the answers. So thank you again for your time today, everyone.
And thanks to our three biologists. Thank you very much, Sarah, Andrew, and Juan. Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks to all of you for helping fund their work. We're incredibly grateful.
Yeah, thank you all very much.
Thank you. Everyone, take care.
Bye. Good night.